The morning sun glinted off the hood of Amara Johnson's silver sedan as she drove through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge. She hummed along to a jazz tune, feeling good about the day ahead. Her meeting with the youth center had gone well, and she was heading home to change before her afternoon shift at the community garden. The red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, catching her by surprise. Amara checked her speedometer. She was going exactly at the limit. With a small sigh, she signaled and pulled over to the curb, reaching for her wallet in her purse. Officer Richard Hayes watched the sedan pull over neatly. He'd been having a rough day. His supervisor had chewed him out that morning for a backlog of paperwork, and the coffee machine at the station had broken down again. When he spotted the silver sedan with a tail light that looked slightly dimmer than regulation, he saw an easy ticket to fill his quota. Amara rolled down her window as the officer approached. "Good morning, officer," she said with a polite smile. "Is something wrong?" Hayes looked down at her, his face hard and unsmiling. "License and registration," he said flatly, not bothering with a greeting. Something in his tone made Amara's smile fade, but she nodded and handed over her documents. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Hayes asked, glancing at her license. "No, sir, I don't," Amara replied honestly. "Taillight's out," Hayes said, though it wasn't entirely true. The light was merely dimmer than the other, not out completely, and I noticed you were swerving a bit back there. Amara frowned slightly. "I don't think I was swerving, officer, and I checked all my lights just last week." Hayes's expression darkened. "Are you saying I'm lying, ma'am?" "No, not at all," Amara said quickly, keeping her voice calm. "I'm just surprised, that's all." Hayes studied her face, then looked around the inside of her car. "Have you been drinking today?" "No, sir, I don't drink," Amara said, beginning to feel uneasy about the direction this stop was taking. "Step out of the car, please," Hayes ordered, his hand moving to rest on his belt. Amara hesitated for just a moment, then complied. "May I ask why?" "I need to conduct a field sobriety test," Hayes said, watching her closely as she got out. "Something doesn't seem right here." Amara stood beside her car, acutely aware of passing vehicles slowing down to look. She knew the drill. She'd stay calm, follow instructions, and this would be over soon. What she didn't say was that she knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't the first time. "Walk in a straight line, heel to toe," Hayes instructed, pointing to the white line at the edge of the road. Amara did as she was told, walking perfectly along the line. Hayes frowned. "Now touch your nose with your index finger, eyes closed." Again, Amara performed flawlessly. Hayes seemed annoyed at her success. "Open your trunk," he said suddenly. "May I ask why?" Amara questioned, her lawyer's instincts kicking, and despite her resolve to stay compliant. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" Hayes's voice rose slightly. "No, officer," Amara said, walking to the back of her car. "I'm just asking for clarification." She opened the trunk, which contained nothing but a gym bag, a folded blanket, and a small emergency kit. Hayes rummaged through it anyway, finding nothing of interest. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. "Just workout clothes," Amara replied. "You're welcome to check." Hayes unzipped the bag, pawing through her neatly folded exercise outfit and sneakers. His frustration seemed to grow with each passing moment. Amara watched him carefully, keeping her expression neutral despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Who do you work for?" Hayes asked abruptly, zipping the bag closed with unnecessary force. "I'm an attorney with Jackson and Powell," Amara answered. "Civil Rights Division." Something flickered across Hayes's face, a mix of surprise and something darker. "A lawyer, huh? That explains the attitude." "I don't believe I've given you any attitude, officer," Amara said quietly. Hayes stepped closer to her. "You know, people like you think you're above the law, always questioning authority, always making our jobs harder." The implication in "people like you" wasn't lost on Amara, but she kept her composure. "I respect the law greatly, officer. It's my profession." "Empty your pockets," Hayes ordered, ignoring her response. Amara carefully pulled out her phone, a set of keys, and a tissue. Hayes took the phone from her hand, looking at the lock screen. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing to the photo of Amara. "With her husband. My husband," she replied simply. not volunteering that he was Captain David Johnson of the Pine Ridge Police Department's 3rd Precinct. David and she had agreed long ago that she would never use his position to get special treatment or to avoid mistreatment. Hayes handed the phone back with a dismissive gesture. Then he walked around her car once more, shining his flashlight into the windows even though it was broad daylight. "I smell something suspicious," he declared, though there was nothing to smell. "Officer Hayes," Amara said, reading his nameplate. "For the first time, I'd like to know exactly what I'm being detained for." Hayes's face hardened. "That's Officer Hayes to you. And you're being detained on suspicion of driving under the influence and possible possession of illegal substances." "That's ridiculous," Amara said, her patience finally beginning to wear thin. "I've passed all your sobriety tests and there are no substances in my car." "Are you calling me a liar again?" Hayes stepped closer, using his height to tower over. "Maybe we should continue this conversation down at the station." A chill ran down Amara's spine, but she stood her ground. "Am I under arrest?" "You're being detained for further questioning," Hayes said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Amara knew her rights, and she knew this was wrong. But she also knew what could happen if she resisted, even verbally. With her heart pounding, she turned around slowly. "This is unnecessary, Officer Hayes," she said as the cold metal closed around her wrists. "I've been cooperative." "That's for me to decide," Hayes replied, leading her to his patrol car. He opened the back door and guided her inside, his hand pressing down on her head as she ducked to enter. Through the partition, Amara heard Hayes radio in. "Got a possible DUI here. Taking her in for processing." There was a pause as dispatch responded. "Yeah, she's being difficult, claims she's some hotshot lawyer." As the patrol car pulled away from her sedan, Amara closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. She thought about calling out, about telling Hayes exactly who her husband was. One word from her about being married to Captain Johnson would change everything. But that wasn't who she was, and more importantly, that wasn't how things should work. Instead, she watched the streets pass by, mentally documenting every detail of the interaction, the unnecessary escalation, the vague and shifting accusations, the thinly veiled comments. If this was happening to her, an attorney who knew her rights and had resources, what was happening to others without her advantages? At the station, Hayes led her through the side entrance, bypassing the main desk. "Let's get you processed," he said with a smirk that made her skin crawl. "I'd like to make my phone call," Amara stated firmly. "All in good time," Hayes replied, guiding her toward a holding cell. "You can cool off in here first while I do the paperwork." The cell door clanged shut behind her, and Amara stood in the center of the small space, still handcuffed. Through the bars, she could see Hayes talking to another officer, both of them glancing her way occasionally. She wondered how long it would be before someone recognized her, not as Captain Johnson's wife, but as Amara Johnson, the attorney, who had recently won a high-profile case against the department for a similar situation. As she waited, Amara made a decision. This wouldn't be just another incident to be covered up with an apology and a dismissal of charges. This time, she would see it through to the end, no matter what, because some things needed to change, and sometimes change only came when people were willing to stand their ground. Hayes had no idea what he had just set in motion, or how his actions would ripple through the department in the days to come. For now, Amara settled onto the hard bench, her back straight, her gaze steady, and waited for what would come next. The holding cell was cold. Amara sat on the hard bench, her back against the concrete wall, watching the clock tick past another hour. They'd finally removed her handcuffs, but Officer Hayes had made no move to process her further or grant her phone call. She knew what he was doing, letting her stew, hoping fear would build. It was a tactic she'd heard about from clients, but experiencing it firsthand was different. 2 cells down, a young man tapped a nervous rhythm against his knee. Across the hall, an elderly woman dozed fitfully on a similar bench. Amara wondered about their stories, whether they too had been brought in on flimsy pretexts. At the precinct's front desk, Officer Lily Chen was sorting through incoming reports when a name on the detention log caught her eye. She blinked, sure she'd misread it, but there it was, Amara Johnson. Chen knew that name. Everyone in the department did. Not just because she was married to Captain Johnson, but because she was a formidable civil rights attorney in her own right. Chen looked up as the front doors swung open and Captain David Johnson walked in, his uniform crisp as always. He nodded at her with his usual friendly smile. "Morning, Chen. Anything I should know about?" Chen hesitated, her hand hovering over the detention log. The captain ran a tight ship, but he was fair. He never asked for special treatment for himself or his family. In fact, he'd made it clear that's not how things worked under his command. "Sir," she said carefully, "there's something you should see." She slid the log across the desk. David's eyes scanned the page, then stopped. His expression didn't change, but Chen saw his shoulders tense slightly. "Who brought her in?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Officer Hayes, sir, about 2 hours ago." David nodded once. "Thank you, Chen." He walked toward his office, his pace measured. Inside, he closed the door and stood for a moment, collecting his thoughts. This wasn't the first time Amara had been pulled over without cause. As a black woman, driving in certain neighborhoods, it happened more often than either of them liked to admit. But being actually brought in and detained, that was new. He picked up his phone, then set it down again. He and Amara had an understanding. She didn't want special treatment because of who she was married to. She believed the system should work fairly for everyone, not just those with connections. And as much as it pained him, he respected that. Knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Lieutenant Wilson entered without waiting for a response. "Did you see who's in holding?" Wilson asked without preamble. "I just found out," David replied, his voice still carefully controlled. Wilson shook his head. "Hayes didn't know. Hell, I don't think he even checked her ID properly, just saw what he wanted to see." "What's the official reason for detention?" Wilson looked uncomfortable. "Suspected DUI and resisting an officer." David raised an eyebrow. "At 10 in the morning, Amara doesn't even drink." "I know that, sir." Wilson shifted his weight. "Look, you know Hayes has had complaints before. 3 in the last year alone." "All dismissed due to insufficient evidence," David said, making air quotes. It was a sore point between them. Wilson handled personnel complaints, and David had pushed for stricter reviews, but the union protections were strong, and without video evidence, it usually came down to an officer's word against a civilian's. "What do you want to do?" Wilson asked. David rubbed his temples. What he wanted to do was march down to holding and personally escort his wife out. What he wanted to do was suspend Hayes on the spot. But neither action would serve the larger purpose. "Nothing," he finally said. "Nothing," Wilson repeated, surprised. "Not yet," David clarified. "Let's see how this plays out. If I intervene now, Hayes will never learn, and nothing will change." Wilson looked skeptical. "You're going to let your wife sit in a cell to teach Hayes a lesson?" "No," David said firmly. "I'm respecting my wife's wishes to be treated like any other citizen, and I'm giving Hayes enough rope to hang himself professionally." In the holding area, Hayes was finally returning. He unlocked Amara's cell with a jangle of keys. "Ready to be more cooperative?" he asked, smirking. Amara stood, straightening her jacket. "I'd like to make my phone call now." Hayes sighed dramatically. "Still on about that? Fine. This way." He led her to a phone mounted on the wall near the processing desk. Amara dialed not her husband's number, but her law firm's. "Jackson and Powell, how may I direct your call?" came the receptionist's voice. "This is Amara Johnson. I need to speak with Patricia immediately." There was a pause. "Ms. Johnson, is everything all right?" "Not exactly. Please put me through." Moments later, Patricia Powell's concerned voice came on the line. "Amara? What's going on? You missed our 11 o'clock. "I've been detained at the 3rd Precinct," Amara explained calmly. "Officer Richard Hayes brought me in on fabricated charges of DUI and resisting arrest." Hayes, who had been half listening nearby, suddenly paid closer attention. "The 3rd precinct," Patricia repeated. "Isn't that—" "Yes," Amara cut her off. "But I'm calling you as my attorney, not for any other reason. I'd like you to come down and observe the proceedings. No special treatment, just standard legal representation." Patricia understood immediately. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Amara hung up and turned to Hayes. "My attorney is on her way." Hayes frowned. "Attorney, you're not under arrest yet, just detained for questioning." "Nevertheless, I'm exercising my right to counsel," Amara replied evenly. "And I'd like to know exactly what charges you're planning to file, Officer Hayes." For the first time, Hayes looked slightly uncomfortable. "Like I said, suspected DUI and resisting a lawful order. I passed all field sobriety tests and I complied with every instruction you gave," Amara pointed out. "So I'm curious what evidence you have." "My professional observation," Hayes said stiffly. "I see." Amara nodded. "And will that stand up to a blood test, which I'm happy to take right now?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. The situation was starting to feel less straightforward than when he'd brought her in. "Look," he finally said, lowering his voice. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. How about we chalk this up to a misunderstanding, and you can be on your way?" Amara looked at him steadily. "No, Officer Hayes. I don't think we should do that. At all. I think we should follow proper procedure all the way through." Hayes's face hardened again. "Have it your way. Back to the cell until your attorney arrives." As Amara was led back to the holding cell, Sergeant Rodriguez approached Hayes at the desk. "What's this I hear about you bringing in a DUI at 10 a.m.? Rodriguez asked, looking skeptical. Hayes shrugged. "Woman was driving erratically, failed the field test." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because Chen mentioned the name, and I gotta say, it raised some flags for me." "What's the big deal? She's just some mouthy lawyer," Hayes said dismissively. Rodriguez stared at him. "You didn't run her ID, did you?" "I glanced at it," Hayes said, defensively. "Johnson, something Johnson." "Amara Johnson," Rodriguez specified. "Civil rights attorney. Won the Torres case against the department last year." Hayes felt the first stirrings of real unease. "So what? She was still—" "And," Rodriguez continued, cutting him off, "she happens to be married to Captain Johnson." The color drained from Hayes's face. "What? No way. She didn't say anything about—" "Why would she?" Rodriguez asked. "From what I hear, she doesn't use that connection. Ever." Hayes swallowed hard. "The captain doesn't know yet, right?" Rodriguez just looked at him pityingly. "In this building? He probably knew before you finished booking her." As if on cue, Officer Chen's voice came over the intercom. "Officer Hayes, report to Captain Johnson's office immediately." Hayes stood frozen for a moment, then squared his shoulders. "It's fine. I was just doing my job. He'll understand that." Rodriguez shook his head as Hayes walked away. "No, man. I really don't think he will." In his office, David Johnson stood, looking out the window, his back to the door when Hayes entered. The captain didn't turn around immediately. "Sir," Hayes began. "I can explain." "Officer Hayes," David said, finally turning to face him. "I understand you've detained a citizen on suspicion of DUI and resisting arrest." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, sir, but I didn't realize—" David held up a hand, stopping him. "Her identity is irrelevant to this discussion." "But, sir—" "What is relevant," David continued firmly, "is whether proper procedure was followed and whether there was just cause for the detention. So please explain to me exactly what happened." Hayes took a deep breath. "I observed a vehicle with a defective taillight. When I approached, the driver seemed nervous and evasive. I detected what I believed to be signs of intoxication and conducted a field sobriety test." "Which the driver passed?" David asked, his tone making it clear he already knew the answer. "The results were inconclusive," Hayes said lamely. "Were they?" David picked up a folder from his desk. "Because I have the dashcam footage here. Would you like to view it together?" Hayes felt his stomach drop. He'd forgotten about the dash cam in his haste. Outside in the hall, Wilson and Rodriguez exchanged glances as Hayes's voice rose in protest, followed by the captain's measured but firm responses. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone told them everything they needed to know. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Amara sat quietly, her eyes closed. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. She was sad and tired and resolved. This moment, uncomfortable as it was, represented everything she fought against in her professional life. The arbitrary exercise of power, the presumption of guilt, the different America that existed for different people. She opened her eyes as footsteps approached. Patricia Powell stood outside the cell, briefcase in hand, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Ready to get started?" Patricia asked. Amara nodded, standing up. More than ready. As they walked together toward the processing area, Amara caught a glimpse of her husband through his office window. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. No words were exchanged, no gestures made, but an understanding passed between them. This wasn't about them personally anymore. It was about something much bigger, a system that needed change and the courage to demand it. The conference room door closed with a soft click that somehow seemed louder than a slam. Inside, 3 people sat in a triangle of tension. Captain David Johnson at the head of the table, Officer Richard Hayes to his right, and Lieutenant Wilson to his left, there as a witness. The room felt too warm despite the air conditioning humming steadily overhead. "Let's review the facts," David said, his voice calm but tight. He placed a folder on the table between them. "At approximately 10:17 this morning, you pulled over a woman for what you claimed was a defective taillight." Hayes nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir. The dash cam footage shows the taillight was functioning. It appeared dimmer from my vantage point," Hayes insisted. David continued as if Hayes hadn't spoken. "You then administered a field sobriety test, which the footage clearly shows the driver passed without any issues." Hayes shifted in his seat. "With all due respect, sir, certain signs of intoxication aren't always visible on camera." "Such as?" David's question hung in the air. "The smell of alcohol, for one," Hayes said, grasping at straws. "Interesting." David leaned forward slightly. "Because the blood test you eventually ordered came back with a 0.0 BAC level." Hayes looked down at his hands. The captain continued flipping through the file. "You then searched her vehicle without consent or probable cause, detained her without reading her rights, and brought her in on charges that had no factual basis." David closed the folder. "Would you care to explain?" Hayes finally looked up, his face flushed. "Sir, if I had known she was your wife—" "Stop." David's voice cut through the room like a blade. "That is exactly the problem, Hayes. This isn't about who she is. This is about what you did, and what you did would be just as wrong if she were a stranger to me." In the silence that followed, the wall clock's ticking seemed unnaturally loud. Lieutenant Wilson cleared his throat. "Officer Hayes, this isn't an isolated incident," Wilson said, opening his own folder. "We have 3 other complaints against you in the past year, all with similar patterns." "Those were dismissed," Hayes protested. "They were," David agreed, "and that's on us. The department failed those citizens by not taking their complaints seriously enough. We failed to hold you accountable, and that ends today." Down the hall, in another room, Amara sat with her colleague Patricia Powell and Sergeant Rodriguez. The sergeant placed a cup of water in front of her. "I apologize for the delay, Ms. Johnson," Rodriguez said formally. "We're taking your statement very seriously." Amara nodded. "I appreciate that, Sergeant. And I want to be clear, I'm not looking for special treatment." "No one's suggesting that," Patricia interjected, her tone professional. "My client was unlawfully detained and deserves the same justice as any other citizen." Rodriguez nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Of course, if you could walk me through the events as you remember them." Amara recounted everything methodically. The initial stop, Hayes's changing justifications, the sobriety test she knew she'd passed, the search of her car, the comments with their barely veiled implications, and finally, her detention without proper cause. You never identified yourself as Captain Johnson's wife? Rodriguez asked. No, Amara said firmly. That shouldn't matter. And it shouldn't take being married to a police captain for someone to be treated fairly by law enforcement. Rodriguez made a note, then asked, And you're certain Officer Hayes never smelled alcohol or observed any behaviors that might reasonably suggest intoxication? Patricia leaned forward. Sergeant, the blood test already confirmed my client had no alcohol in her system, and the dashcam footage shows she passed all field sobriety tests with flying colors. Are you suggesting she was somehow intoxicated by something that doesn't show up on standard tests and doesn't affect motor skills? Rodriguez had the good grace to look embarrassed. I'm just following protocol, Miss Powell. Then follow it by asking Officer Hayes why he falsified a police report, Patricia replied crisply. In the break room, officers gathered in small clusters, voices low but urgent. The news had spread quickly. Officer Hayes had detained the captain's wife, apparently without realizing who she was. Opinions were divided. Hayes is toast, Officer Chen said, stirring her coffee. You don't mess with the captain's family. I don't know, Officer Diaz countered. Johnson's always been big on treating everyone the same. Maybe he'll go easy to prove a point. You're both missing the real issue, Officer Washington cut in. He was a 20-year veteran, one of the few black officers in the precinct. This isn't about Hayes being in trouble for messing with the wrong person. It's about him finally getting caught doing what he's been doing for years. The room quieted as the others turned to look at him. We all know Hayes has a pattern, Washington continued, his voice steady. We've seen how he treats certain people at traffic stops. We've heard the comments he makes when he thinks only certain ears are listening, and most of us have said nothing. Officer Chen looked down at her cup. It's complicated. It's really not, Washington replied. And now it's blown up in a way that can't be ignored. The question isn't what happens to Hayes. It's what happens to the rest of us. Back in the conference room, the confrontation had escalated. Hayes had abandoned his professional demeanor. This is a witch hunt, he declared, his face red. One mistake and my whole career is on the line. This wasn't a mistake, David said evenly. This was a pattern of behavior finally caught on camera with a victim who can't be ignored. So that's it? Hayes laughed bitterly. Your wife gets special treatment after all. David's patience finally broke. He leaned across the table, his voice low and intense. Let me be absolutely clear, Officer Hayes. If you had done this to anyone, and I had this evidence, we would be having the exact same conversation. The fact that the citizen you chose to harass happens to be my wife changes nothing except that you can't hide behind the blue wall this time. Hayes fell silent, his bravado faltering under David's steady gaze. You're suspended, effective immediately, David continued. There will be a full investigation, and I'm recommending termination to the review board. You can't do that, Hayes protested weakly. Actually, he can, Lieutenant Wilson interjected. And if you fight it, all the evidence becomes public, including the dash cam footage, the false report, and the testimonies we're gathering from your previous stops that were swept under the rug. Hayes stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is bull. You're dismissed. Officer, David cut him off. Turn in your badge and gun to Lieutenant Wilson before you leave the building. As Hayes stormed out, slamming the door behind him, David sat back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. Wilson watched him with concern. You okay, boss? David rubbed his temples. No, not really. I should have addressed this pattern long ago. Before it came to this. We all should have, Wilson admitted. The signs were there. In the hallway, Hayes nearly collided with Amara as she and Patricia exited their meeting with Rodriguez. For a moment, they stood face to face, the air between them charged with tension. Hayes opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. His eyes, once filled with arrogant disdain, now held a mixture of anger and fear. Without a word, he stepped around her and continued down the hall. Amara watched him go, her expression unreadable. Patricia touched her arm gently. You okay? I'm fine, Amara replied, though her voice suggested otherwise. Just thinking about how many others have been in my position without the resources or connections to fight back. As they walked toward the exit, David emerged from the conference room. The three of them stood awkwardly in the hallway, professional boundaries suddenly unclear in this unprecedented situation. "Captain," Patricia nodded formally. "Ms. Powell," David returned the nod, then looked at his wife. "Amara." "David," she acknowledged, her voice softer. Patricia glanced between them. "I'll wait outside," she said tactfully, continuing toward the exit. Once alone, the professional facade cracked slightly. David's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry this happened," he said quietly. "It's not your fault," Amara replied. "Isn't it?" "It's my precinct, my responsibility." Amara shook her head. "The culture was here long before you took command. You can't change it overnight." "Hayes has been suspended," David told her. "I've recommended termination." Amara looked troubled. "Because of who I am?" "No," David said firmly. "Because of what he did, and because it's not the first time." He hesitated. "But I won't lie. It might not have come to light so clearly if it had been someone else." "That's what bothers me the most," Amara admitted. "The system shouldn't work this way. Justice shouldn't depend on who you know or who you're married to." David nodded solemnly. "I know. And that's why this can't end with Hayes. This has to be a turning point for the entire department." In the squad room, the tension was palpable as officers went about their duties, stealing glances at the hallway where their captain and his wife stood in quiet conversation. Word had spread about Hayes' suspension, and everyone was wondering what would come next. Officer Washington approached Officer Chen at her desk. "Meeting in the break room after shift. Spread the word, but keep it quiet." "What's it about?" Chen asked. Washington looked meaningfully toward the hallway. "About making sure this moment doesn't go to waste. About speaking up next time instead of looking the other way." Chen nodded slowly. "I'll be there." As Amara finally left the building escorted by Patricia, she noticed officers watching her from windows and doorways. Some looked away when she met their eyes. Others nodded respectfully. She wondered what they were thinking, how they saw her role in what was unfolding. Patricia squeezed her arm gently. "This is going to make waves, you know." "I know," Amara said, her resolve strengthening. "And maybe that's exactly what's needed." Behind them, in his office, David Johnson stared at Hayes' personnel file and the stack of civilian complaints that had been dismissed over the years. He thought about the changes he'd tried to implement since taking command and how they'd been met with resistance at every turn. The old guard, the entrenched culture, the thin blue line that protected its own at all costs. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Commissioner? It's Johnson. We need to talk about systemic changes at the 3rd Precinct. Yes, it's about the Hayes situation, but it's much bigger than that. I think it's time for a complete overhaul of how we handle civilian complaints and officer accountability." As he outlined his proposals to his superior, David knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of real possibility. Sometimes it took a personal shakeup to see things clearly, and sometimes it took seeing someone you love treated unjustly to understand how many others had suffered. The same fate in silence. The system wouldn't change overnight, but perhaps today had cracked open a door that had long been sealed shut. The community center hummed with tension as people filled the rows of folding chairs. The monthly town hall meeting rarely drew more than a dozen residents, but tonight, the room was packed to capacity. Word had spread fast about what happened at the 3rd Precinct, growing with each telling until it became something of an urban legend. The truth, as Amara knew, was powerful enough without embellishment. She sat in the back row, deliberately inconspicuous, watching as Commissioner Randall adjusted the microphone at the podium. Beside him, David stood straight-backed in his uniform, his expression professionally neutral. They hadn't planned to attend the same meeting. David had official duties here, while Amara came as a private citizen. But there they were, connected yet separate in their roles. "Folks, let's get started," the commissioner announced, bringing the murmuring crowd to attention. As you know, we're here to discuss community concerns and department updates. Given recent events, we've adjusted our agenda to address some pressing matters first. A hand shot up immediately. The commissioner nodded to a middle-aged woman in the front row. Is it true an officer was suspended for racially profiling and falsely arresting someone? She asked, getting straight to the point. Commissioner Randall cleared his throat. There was an incident involving Officer Richard Hayes that resulted in his suspension pending a full investigation. I can't comment further on ongoing personnel matters. This non-answer sent a ripple of dissatisfaction through the crowd. Another resident stood up without waiting to be called on. We've been talking about problems with certain officers for years, the man said, his voice carrying across the room. Nothing ever changes. Why should we believe this time is different? Commissioner Randall looked uncomfortable, but before he could respond, David stepped forward. May I address this, Commissioner? He asked quietly. The commissioner nodded, looking almost relieved as he stepped aside. David faced the crowd directly. You're right, he said simply. For too long, legitimate complaints have been minimized or dismissed. The department has hidden behind procedures and paperwork instead of addressing real problems. That ends now. A surprised hush fell over the room. Police officials rarely admitted fault so bluntly in public forums. What exactly are you going to do differently? Someone called out skeptically. David nodded, acknowledging the fair question. 3 concrete changes, effective immediately. First, all officers in the 3rd precinct will wear body cameras at all times while on duty, with strict penalties for disabling them. Second, we're establishing a civilian review board with real authority to examine complaints against officers. And third, we're implementing a new training program focused specifically on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. From her seat in the back, Amara watched the crowd's reaction. There was interest, but also understandable skepticism. Promises had been made before. A young woman stood up next. That all sounds good on paper, but who's going to be on this civilian review board? And what kind of real authority will they actually have? David looked toward the woman. The board will include representatives from all neighborhoods in our jurisdiction, with specific attention to communities that have historically been over-policed. As for authority, they'll have access to all evidence, including body cam footage, and their recommendations will be binding in cases of clear misconduct. This caused a stir among the uniformed officers standing along the wall. One of them, Sergeant Miller, looked particularly displeased. Amara made a mental note of his reaction. The questions continued for nearly an hour, growing increasingly specific and pointed. Through it all, David remained composed, answering honestly even when the answers weren't what people wanted to hear. When he didn't know something, he said so. When the department had failed, he acknowledged it without excuses. Toward the end, an elderly man with a cane rose slowly to his feet. The room quieted as he spoke. I've lived in this neighborhood for 72 years, he said, his voice weathered but strong. Been coming to these meetings for 40. Never once heard a police captain talk like you just did. He paused, leaning on his cane. The question is, are your officers behind you on this? Because if they're not, none of it matters. David didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room at his officers, then back to the elderly man. Not all of them, he admitted. Change is hard and some will resist it, but enough are. And those who can't or won't adapt to a more just approach to policing won't have a place in this precinct. As the meeting wrapped up, Amara slipped out quietly, avoiding drawing attention to herself. Outside in the cool evening air, she took a deep breath, processing what she'd witnessed. A week ago, she wouldn't have believed such transparency was possible. The next morning, Amara sat in her law office reviewing case files when her assistant knocked on the door. There's a Sergeant Rodriguez here to see you, her assistant said, looking confused. He says it's important. Amara's brow furrowed. Show him in. Rodriguez entered, looking uncomfortable in the law office setting. He held a thick folder under his arm. Ms. Johnson. He nodded formally. Thank you for seeing me. What can I do for you, Sergeant? Amara asked, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Rodriguez sat down, placing the folder between them. I'm here unofficially, He began, then stopped and shook his head. No, that's not right. I'm here as a police officer who's tired of looking the other way. He pushed the folder toward her. These are copies of civilian complaints against officers in our precinct from the past 3 years. Specifically, complaints with patterns similar to what happened to you. Questionable stops, escalation without cause, disparate treatment based on race. Amara looked at the folder but didn't touch it. Why are you bringing this to me? Because most of these complaints were dismissed or buried, Rodriguez said bluntly. And because you're not just another victim, you're someone who can do something about it. Does Captain Johnson know you're here? Amara asked carefully. Rodriguez shook his head. No, and he can't. There are officers who would see this as a betrayal. But after what happened to you, after seeing how the system protected Hayes for so long, he trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. It's the right thing to do. Amara finally pulled the folder toward her and opened it. Inside were dozens of complaint forms, witness statements, and internal memos, many with dismissed insufficient evidence stamped across them in red. Some of these people are former clients of mine, she noted, scanning the names. I figured as much, Rodriguez replied. Look at the officers named. It's not just Hayes. There's a pattern across multiple officers, particularly in certain neighborhoods. Amara closed the folder. Why now, Sergeant? You've had access to this information for years. Rodriguez looked down at his hands. Because I was part of the problem. I never filed false reports or mistreated anyone myself, but I never spoke up either. I told myself it wasn't my place, that the system would handle it. He met her eyes. What happened to you forced a lot of us to face what we've been ignoring. After Rodriguez left, Amara sat for a long time staring at the folder. Then she picked up her phone. Patricia, clear your afternoon. We need to talk. Across town at the precinct, David faced his own confrontation. Lieutenant Wilson had just informed him that several officers were threatening to request transfers if the new policies went forward. They're saying it undermines their authority, Wilson explained, looking troubled. Makes their jobs harder, puts them at risk. Their jobs are supposed to be about protecting and serving the community, David replied firmly. Not exercising authority for its own sake. I know that, sir. But change is hard, especially for officers who've been doing things a certain way their whole careers, David sighed. Who's leading the pushback? Miller's the vocal one, Wilson admitted, but he's got support from about a third of the force. David wasn't surprised. Sergeant Miller had been with the department for 20 years and had made his views on modern policing clear many times. Up a meeting, David decided. Not just with Miller, but with all the officers who have concerns. Let's get everything out in the open. That afternoon, the tension in the briefing room was thick enough to cut. David stood at the front, facing rows of officers with expressions ranging from supportive to openly hostile. I understand there are concerns about the changes we're implementing, David began. I want to hear them directly from you. Miller stood up immediately. With all due respect, Captain, these new policies tie our hands. Body cams recording everything we do, civilians second-guessing our decisions, all this extra training taking us off the streets. It sends a message that you don't trust us to do our jobs. Several officers nodded in agreement. David took a moment before responding. Trust goes both ways, Sergeant. We're asking the community to trust us with enormous power, the power to detain, to arrest, even to use deadly force. In return, we need to be transparent and accountable. We already are accountable, Miller argued. We have procedures, regulations, oversight. Do we? David challenged. Officer Hayes had multiple complaints against him that went nowhere. If his misconduct hadn't affected someone with resources and knowledge of the system, he'd still be out there. So this is about your wife, Miller said, a dangerous edge to his voice. The room went silent. David felt all eyes on him, waiting for his reaction. No, Sergeant, he said quietly. This is about every person who's been treated unjustly and had nowhere to turn. My wife happens to be one of them, but she's far from the only one. The difference is she had the means to fight back. Many don't. From the back of the room, Officer Washington spoke up. "I've been on the force for 20 years. Every single one of us in this room has seen things that weren't right. Most of us have stayed quiet about it. Maybe it's time we stopped." Miller turned to face him. "You're taking his side?" "I'm taking the side of doing our jobs the right way," Washington replied evenly. "And if that means some extra accountability, I'm okay with that." As the debate continued, officers began to speak up on both sides. Some shared Miller's concerns about being hamstrung by new regulations. Others admitted they'd seen problematic behavior and done nothing. A few even confessed to their own mistakes in the past. By the end of the meeting, nothing was resolved. But something important had happened. The unspoken code of silence had been broken. Issues that had long been ignored were finally being discussed openly. Later that evening, David arrived home to find Amara sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. "Long day?" he asked, loosening his tie. "You could say that," she replied, pushing a stack of folders aside. "Rodriguez came to see me." David raised his eyebrows. "About what?" "He brought me copies of civilian complaints that were dismissed over the past 3 years." She watched her husband's reaction carefully. "Did you know about all of these?" David sat down heavily. "Not all. Some happened before I took command. Others—" He trailed off, looking troubled. "The system is designed to protect its own. Even when I pushed for investigations, the union lawyers would get involved. Witnesses would suddenly become unavailable. Evidence would be deemed inconclusive. That's why the system needs to change," Amara said quietly. "And not just at your precinct." "What are you thinking?" Amara took a deep breath. "Patricia and I are considering a class action lawsuit. Not just against individual officers, but against the department as a whole for systematic failure to address discriminatory policing." David was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired but resolute. "If that's what it takes to force real change, then do it. But know that it won't be easy. Not professionally, and not for us." "I know," Amara said, softly. "Are you okay with that?" David reached across the table and took her hand. "I became a police officer to help people, to make things better. Somewhere along the way, too many of us forgot that. Maybe it's time we were reminded." As they sat together in their kitchen, both knew they were standing at a crossroads, not just for their marriage, but for the community they both served in different ways. The path forward wouldn't be easy or straightforward. There would be resistance, backlash, and painful confrontations ahead. But for the first time in a long while, there was also hope. Hope that what had begun as a single unjust traffic stop might become the catalyst for meaningful change. Hope that systems built to protect the powerful might be reformed to serve everyone equally. Hope that the truth, when finally spoken aloud, might begin to heal wounds long left to fester in silence. 6 months passed like a whirlwind. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of the courthouse as Amara straightened her blazer, mentally preparing for the day ahead. The class action lawsuit had grown far beyond what she and Patricia had initially envisioned. What began with 24 plaintiffs now represented over 100 citizens who had experienced similar treatment from officers at the 3rd Precinct and beyond. Today was the final day of hearings before the judge would rule on whether to accept the settlement agreement that had been painstakingly negotiated over weeks of tense meetings. "Ready?" Patricia asked, joining her at the courthouse steps. "As I'll ever be," Amara replied, glancing at the crowd gathering outside. Community members, activists, reporters, and off-duty officers had all shown up to witness the culmination of what had become the biggest police reform case in the city's history. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Amara noticed familiar and unfamiliar faces alike, clients past and present, community leaders, police union representatives, and in the back corner, quietly observing, her husband, David. They exchanged a brief nod, their personal and professional, worlds overlapping yet distinct. Judge Eleanor Winters entered, and the room fell silent. "Before I rule on the proposed settlement," Judge Winters began, I want to hear final statements from both parties. Ms. Johnson, as lead counsel for the plaintiffs, you may begin." Amara approached the podium, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. This wasn't just about her experience anymore. It was about a system that had failed too many for too long. "Your Honor, the settlement before you today represents more than monetary compensation for the plaintiffs, though that aspect is important. More significantly, it mandates structural changes that will help prevent future injustices." She outlined the key provisions: mandatory body cameras with strict penalties for non-compliance, a civilian oversight board with genuine authority, comprehensive bias training developed with community input, revised use of force policies, and a transparent system for tracking and investigating complaints against officers. These reforms won't solve every problem overnight, Amara acknowledged, but they create accountability where there was none, transparency where there was obscurity, and a voice for those who have too often gone unheard. As she returned to her seat, the city attorney rose to speak for the defense. Thomas Reynolds had been a formidable opponent throughout the proceedings, but even he seemed to recognize that this case had revealed problems that could no longer be ignored. "Your Honor, while the city maintains that many of the individual allegations were the result of a few bad actors rather than systematic issues, we acknowledge that our processes for addressing misconduct have been inadequate. The reforms outlined in this settlement are stringent but necessary to restore community trust." After both sides had spoken, Judge Winters reviewed her notes silently. The courtroom held its collective breath. Having reviewed all evidence and arguments, the judge finally announced, "I find that this settlement is fair, reasonable, and in the public interest. The agreement is approved." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo the breaking of an old order. Around the courtroom, reactions varied. Tears of relief from plaintiffs, somber nods from city officials, mixed expressions from the officers present. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed Amara and Patricia. "Ms. Johnson, how does it feel to win such a landmark case?" Amara chose her words carefully. "This isn't about winning or losing. It's about acknowledging harm that's been done and committing to do better. The real test will be in the implementation of these reforms. Will you continue to work with the police department on implementation?" "Yes," Amara confirmed. "A joint committee of community members, legal experts, and police representatives will oversee the process. The goal isn't to punish officers, it's to create a department that truly serves and protects everyone equally." As the press conference continued, Amara noticed Officer Richard Hayes standing at the edge of the crowd, watching. Their eyes met briefly. He no longer wore a uniform. The investigation had led to his termination 3 months earlier. For a moment, Amara wondered what he was thinking, whether he understood even now why this had all been necessary. Then he turned and walked away, just another civilian now. Later that evening, Amara found herself in an unexpected place, the 3rd Precinct community room, where officers and neighborhood residents had gathered for the first meeting of the new Civilian Oversight Board. The atmosphere was awkward, with invisible lines seemingly drawn between those in uniform and those without. David stood at the front of the room, looking both tired and determined. "I know many of you are skeptical about why we're here," he began. "Some officers believe these new measures undermine their authority. Some community members doubt anything will really change. You all have good reasons for your concerns." He paused, looking around the room. "But we're here because something broke, not just in one incident 6 months ago, but in countless interactions over many years. Trust was broken, and we can't protect and serve without trust." From her seat near the back, Amara watched as David introduced the board members, a diverse group that included a retired judge, a social worker, a former officer, and residents from various neighborhoods. Then came the part she hadn't expected. "And finally," David said, "we've created a new position of community liaison officer. This person will work directly with the board, ensuring transparency and accountability on a daily basis. I'm pleased to announce that Officer Lisa Chen has accepted this role." Officer Chen stepped forward, looking nervous but resolute. Amara recognized her as the desk officer who had first noticed her name on the detention log all those months ago. "I took this position because I believe in what we're trying to do," Chen said simply. "I became an officer to help people. Sometimes that means standing up for changes, even when they're difficult." As the meeting progressed, Amara observed something remarkable: actual dialogue beginning to emerge between groups that had long viewed each other with suspicion. It was halting and sometimes tense, but it was happening. Officers spoke about the challenges of their jobs. Residents shared experiences of feeling targeted or ignored. Everyone struggled toward understanding. After the meeting, Chen approached Amara as people were filing out. "Ms. Johnson, do you have a minute?" "Of course," Amara replied, curious. "I wanted to thank you," Chen said, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Not just for the lawsuit, but for how you handled everything. You could have made it personal about you and Officer Hayes, but you made it about the system instead." Amara was surprised by the gratitude. "I was just doing my job." "So was I that day when I saw your name on the log," Chen admitted. "But I almost didn't say anything to the captain. I almost looked the other way because that's what we were trained to do, not make waves." She shook her head. "I've been thinking a lot about that moment, about how many times I've chosen the easy path instead of the right one." "And now?" Amara asked gently. "Now I'm trying to choose differently," Chen replied. "A lot of us are." Across the room, David was deep in conversation with Sergeant Rodriguez and Officer Washington. The three of them had become unofficial leaders of the reform effort within the department. Not everyone had embraced the changes. Several officers, including Sergeant Miller, had transferred to other precincts, but a core group had committed to making them work. Later that night, as Amara and David walked home through their neighborhood, a patrol car drove slowly past. The officer inside nodded respectfully at David, then after a moment's hesitation at Amara as well. "That's new," Amara observed after the car had passed. "Things are changing," David said. "Slowly, but they are." "Do you think it will last?" Amara asked, voicing the doubt that had lingered despite the day's victories. David considered the question seriously. "I think it will, if enough people decide it matters. Real change isn't about policies or settlements. Those are just tools. It's about changing hearts and minds one person at a time." "Like Officer Chen," Amara noted. "Like Chen," David agreed. "Like Rodriguez, like me." He glanced at her. "Like you." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the weight of the day's events settling around them. "You know," David said finally, "when I first became captain, I had all these big plans for reforming the department. I thought I could change things from the top down." "What changed your mind?" Amara asked. "I realized that lasting change doesn't work that way. It happens from the inside out, from the bottom up." He shook his head ruefully. "And sometimes it takes a crisis to create the opportunity." Amara thought about that. 6 months ago, she had been unjustly detained by an officer who saw her only through the lens of his own prejudice. That single incident had spiraled outward, revealing deeper problems, and eventually forcing a reckoning that might otherwise have taken years, if it happened at all. "I never wanted to be the face of this," Amara admitted. "I just wanted the system to work the way it's supposed to." "I know," David said softly. "That's why it had to be you. You never made it about getting special treatment. You made it about ensuring everyone gets fair treatment." As they turned onto their street, Amara noticed a young black woman being pulled over by a patrol car. Without discussion, they both slowed their pace, watching from a distance. The officer approached the car with a respectful demeanor, explained the reason for the stop, a broken taillight, and wrote a warning rather than a ticket. The entire interaction was captured on the officer's body camera, which was prominently displayed on his uniform. "One interaction at a time," David murmured. "One interaction at a time," Amara agreed. The next morning, Amara stood before a group of law students who had been following the case. They had invited her to speak about her experience and the broader implications of the settlement. What I want you to understand, she told them, is that systems don't change because of landmark cases or dramatic confrontations, though those can be catalysts. They change because people within those systems make different choices day after day. She thought about Officer Chen choosing to speak up rather than stay silent, about Rodriguez bringing her the complaints that others had buried, about Washington standing up to his peers, about her husband, willing to challenge a culture he'd been part of for decades. The law gives us tools, she continued, but it's people who create justice or its absence through countless small decisions that most of us never see. A student raised her hand. Do you think what happened to you was necessary for these reforms to happen? Would people have listened otherwise? The question struck at something Amara had been wrestling with for months. No one should have to experience injustice for the system to recognize that injustice exists, she answered carefully. The fact that it often takes a dramatic case to force change is itself a failure of the system. She paused, then continued more personally. But given that it did happen, I'm grateful that it led to something meaningful. That's not always the case. Too often, incidents like mine fade from public memory without creating lasting change. Another student asked, "What happens now? How do you ensure these reforms actually work?" That's the real challenge, Amara acknowledged. Papers get signed, policies get changed, but implementation is where most reforms succeed or fail. That's why the Oversight Committee is so important. It creates ongoing accountability, not just a one-time correction. After the lecture, Amara checked her phone to find a message from Patricia. "Turn on Channel 7 now." Finding a television in the student lounge, she switched to the news just in time to see Officer Chen speaking at a press conference, flanked by David and Commissioner Randall. "Today marks the official launch of our new community policing initiative," Chen was saying. "Every officer in the 3rd Precinct has completed the enhanced training program developed with community input, and our civilian review board is now fully operational." The camera panned to show a diverse group of officers and civilians standing together, not in perfect harmony but in shared purpose. Among them, Amara recognized faces from the lawsuit, community meetings, and the precinct. "We know we haven't solved every problem," Chen continued. "We know we have to earn back trust that was broken long ago, but we're committed to doing the work, day by day, interaction by interaction." As Amara watched, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope, not just for specific reforms or policies, but for the possibility of genuine change in how people saw and treated each other. Later that day, she visited the youth center where she volunteered, helping teenagers understand their rights and responsibilities in interactions with law enforcement. A new face had joined the group, Officer Washington, now part of the community outreach team. "Ms. Johnson," he greeted her with a nod. "Officer Washington," she returned the gesture. Together, they faced the group of curious teenagers, bridging a gap that had once seemed unbridgeable. Not as adversaries, not even merely as allies, but as people committed to building something better than what had come before. "Let's talk about what justice really means," Amara began, looking out at the young faces before her. "Not just in theory, but in practice. Not just in courtrooms, but in everyday interactions on our streets." As she spoke, she thought about how far they had come in 6 months, and how far they still had to go. Change wasn't a destination but a journey, one that required vigilance, courage, and persistence. It had begun with a single unjust traffic stop. Where it would lead, no one could say for certain. But for today, at least, they were moving in the right direction, one step at a time.